Hey everyone, welcome to week 4 of Global Health. This week we are going to talk about the cooperation between health services, specifically the role of transnational organizations. Transnational organizations is another name for NGOs, non-governmental organizations, non-profits, but ones that reach around the globe. And so transnational organizations, we'll talk a lot about those this week. Just a reminder that your annotated bibliographies are coming up due. Hopefully your reading and your research is going very well. If you have any questions, please let me know. I've had a couple of people send me emails. If you ever want to set up a Zoom meeting to talk more about things, just let me know. I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, I assume everything is going well, unless you tell me otherwise, okay? So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the United Nations and the WHO, or the World Health Organization. The WHO is part of the United Nations, and so first we need to learn about the United Nations. The United Nations is a supranational organization. For a lot of people, that's a weird word. We've never heard of it. Supra is a prefix that means over and above, and so supranational means that the United Nations is above national organizations, national governments, and these sort of things, right? And so that presents some challenges when it comes to working with sovereign governments, right? Sovereign governments means that everybody's government gets to make their own choices for their own people and make their own sort of rules, and nobody's the boss of them, right? And yet we have the United Nations, which is supposed to be the boss sort of everybody, right? And so the United Nations is above, but also it depends on cooperation, right? And so it's kind of like a parent saying like, I'm the boss of you, and a kid being like, yeah, well, I might be a shit even if you are the boss of me. Sort of that same sort of thing. One of the bigger issues with the United Nations is that financial contributions are also voluntary. And so the financial contributions, your dues to the United Nations, are due based on your size of your GDP, your country, your ability to pay, and also they're voluntary. So if you don't give the money, then you don't give the money, right? And so what we have seen is that larger countries provide way more money to the United Nations than smaller countries, right? That seems to be a fair sort of system, except when your large nations decide to be brats and decide not to. The United States would be one of those. The United States oftentimes will withhold United Nations dues just because they're mad at something the UN has done, whether it be reprimanding the United States, whether it's pushing for some sort of policy that the United States doesn't like. The US will say like, well, fine, then we won't give you any money. And the US is the largest funder of the United Nations. And so when we don't give money, it's a big deal, right? And so this creates some disbalance in the United Nations because everybody knows like, oh, if you piss off the United States, then they won't give us money. And then a lot of the UN sort of actions fail to continue on. This creates a lot of hegemony. Hegemony is sort of this idea that we have more power and more control over things. And so larger countries with bigger funds say, yeah, we can control stuff because we have all the money, right? And so when we look at sort of the big countries of the world, whether it be Russia and China and the United States and some of these other sort of countries, they say, yeah, if it's something that we want to happen, it pretty much will. And if there's something we don't want to happen, it pretty much won't. And so even though the smaller countries of the world, there's more of them, and sometimes they can band together. When it comes down to it, the money aspect is a really big and huge part of it. When the major players decide that they don't want to do something, then kind of nothing gets done. Other sort of branches underneath the United Nations would be things since in addition to the WHO, would be things like the International Criminal Court, the ICC, or the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. Both ICC and ICJ have done some big things in the past couple of decades around war crimes. So when Bosnia and Herzegovina and when some other sort of big things have gone through, they've prosecuted people in the ICC or in the ICJ to say, hey, we're going to prosecute people for war crimes. Well, guess what? George Bush got taken to the ICJ, and people were like, yeah, we should prosecute George Bush II for war crimes of what happened in Iraq. Well, you can guess that the US was like, yeah, no, we don't have our US president being judged by other sort of people. So again, in these sort of ways, we're like, well, when other countries do it, sure, we'll totally go this sort of way. And then when we don't like it, we're like, oh, never mind, you're not the boss of us. And so you can see how it is hard. Yes, it is a supranational organization, but the control is very much dominated by larger sort of countries. And so this becomes a very big political sort of issue. World Health Organization, same sort of thing. The World Health Organization relies fundamentally a lot on research and development of larger countries, particularly the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the United States Public Health Agency. The CDC is the largest public health agency in the entire world by far. We have people stationed all around the world doing lots of things. We employ lots of foreign nationals. We employ a ton of people, and the WHO gets a lot of information from the CDC and works in cooperation with them. If the US doesn't want something to happen, then it kind of doesn't. And so we see this in a lot of different sort of ways. And so while helpful and while sort of good in a lot of ways, United Nations, WHO, and some of these other supranational organizations have some issues because of national sovereignty and sort of hegemony of large countries. Now, we also have some other sort of organizations, such as International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. Red Cross and Red Crescent are also non-governmental transnational organizations, but they're not supranational organizations because they don't actually have any sort of empowerment capability. They are voluntary organizations. They're the world's largest voluntary organizations. But also, they're not free from controversy. Sometimes people have heard about stuff with Red Cross, and some people have not. There has been a lot of lack of transparency with Red Cross. There's been some issues, particularly in the United States, as things have gone over the past 2 decades, about talking about how they raise money and what they do with the money that they raise and whether or not they're reporting it well. One of the biggest scandals was after 9/11. After 9/11, the Red Cross raised a whole bunch of money and then distributed a whole bunch of it, but then there was still a lot left over because we raised a whole bunch of money for 9/11. Right after 9/11, a couple of years, was Hurricane Katrina. And so some of the money from 9/11 got mixed in with some of the money for Hurricane Katrina, and people were like, hey, I donated that money to New York, not to Katrina, and we don't like what you're doing, and you need to tell us what it is that you're doing with all this sort of money. Also, a lot of people have some issues with how much money the founders or the executives at Red Cross make and how much money they spend on advertising and these sort of things. And so the Red Cross has said, well, it takes money to make money, right? It takes a lot of money for us to be able to produce commercials and to have technological infrastructure so that when they do their big campaigns, like text fire to 1234, those sort of things cost a lot of money. And so we have to have this excess sort of money that doesn't always just go to the people that we're hoping to serve. And so a lot of people get uncomfortable with that. Also, Red Cross and Red Crescent also say, we don't want to tell you all the things that we do, because if we did, then we would have more competitors. And so they, in the United States, are treated as a for-profit organization, even though they are a nonprofit. And so they have a lot of trade secrets that they don't tell. And that, of course, makes people feel like, aren't you supposed to be making things better for everybody? So trade secrets and keeping your financial secret doesn't seem very good if that's what the purpose of these organizations are. Another issue that Red Crescent and Red Cross have faced are looking at other symbols and symbolism for the sort of thing. So the Red Cross really was a cross, as in a Christian organization, from the very beginning. It was started by Christian missionaries who wanted to do some help. Obviously, it has very much evolved from there. It is no longer a organization that is revolved around a religious sort of faith. But the Muslim countries of the world said, hey, we really want to participate in this, but there's just no way we're going to work under a cross because that just doesn't work for us. And so the Red Cross said, okay, well, we'll have another symbol, so the Red Crescent. Then other people were like, hey, we want to have our own symbol too, because we are neither the cross nor are we a crescent. The biggest one would be the Red Star of David. For Israel. Israel's a very political sort of thing. And so there's a lot of places that said like, no, we don't want Israel to come in here. And Israel said, well, we don't want to come help you anyway, but we're definitely not coming to help you unless we have the Star of David. We're not working under the cross or a crescent. It seems like such a petty sort of little thing, but symbols mean stuff and people get really attached to them. And so there have been other sorts of issues there where people don't let other organizations or other sort of religious people into their countries to help, which is supposed to be something that falls away in the spirit of Red Cross and Red Crescent during times of disaster. Okay, so now let's talk about sort of how these big organizations work on a local level, right? Large organizations are really important because they can leverage money, they can leverage political red tape, right? When the Red Cross says, hey, there's a disaster happening in Indonesia, we need to get in there, they don't have to worry about visas and can we do these sort of things, and they can just take their planes, of which they have many, and say, let's load them with supplies, let's take our volunteers and let's go, right? Because in time of a disaster, you don't have time to do all of this sort of, international sort of agreement stuff. And so for Red Cross and Red Crescent, because they've had such a big name and World Health Organization, because they're such a trusted official, they can say, hey, there's a disaster, we need to get there now, we need to do these sort of things. The more time that passes, the more people die, and so they get there to try and help. However, the other thing we know is that in times of crisis, a big outside organization coming in, do they actually know what they're doing, right? Do they know what your little town looks like? Do they know sort of the customs and the knowledge and these sort of things? And so oftentimes they have to rely on local people. So if you look, the Red Cross has just the giant organizations, but we also have local branches. And so here, even in the United States, each city, each county has their own branch of Red Cross, because those are the people who actually do all the things on the ground. The big picture sort of organization organizes stuff, gets things done on a big picture sort of scale, but then we have to rely on local knowledge to know how do we do this sort of thing. But when we have these two different sort of things happening, big picture nationwide kind of stuff and local sort of stuff, how do we get them to work together in an efficient way? That becomes a little bit more challenging, right? And that was part of one of the videos that you watched for this week, is how do we leverage these sort of things in a way that makes sense? The other big issue is, when does something stop being a disaster and start being a long-term sort of issue, right? That was the issue that came up in the video that you were to watch for this week, in terms of, yeah, if something really bad happens, so whether it be a tornado or whether it be a hurricane or whether it be an earthquake or whatever it is, at some point that stops being an acute emergency. People aren't dying anymore, but that doesn't mean everything's back to normal, right? Especially if it was something really destructive. Well, these organizations are supposed to be for emergencies. Well, when does an emergency end? How do we know that it's over and it's now turned into a long-term sort of issue? Do we measure it by deaths? Do we measure it by need? What is it and how do we do it, right? There's a lot of gray area in those sort of ways. One of the things that has happened over the past several decades is that a lot of these organizations have intentionally moved intentionally moved into prevention and treatment in addition to disaster relief. Part of the reason for this is because we know that the more prevention and the more sort of infrastructure that we have in countries, the less likely people are to die in a disaster, right? And so the Red Cross, the WHO, these other sort of places said, well, yeah, it's fine and good to help people in sort of a post-disaster, but if people aren't vaccinated, yeah, maybe we're going in to help because of a hurricane or a tsunami, but also that waterborne illness that could have been avoided by having vaccines or other sort of things actually helps to delay and reduce the amount of deaths that we see post-accident, right? And so vaccines were the big thing that originally started. They said, yeah, this is part of our mission. Although it may not be an acute disaster, it is something that contributes to acute disasters, and it's something that could be considered a disaster in some sort of sense if we have outbreaks and other sort of things. And so they initially started with trying to go around the world and do more access to prevention through vaccines, but we've also seen it spread in other sort of ways, right? We're in the midst of a pandemic right now, and we're seeing all of this stuff on a very real level of where does a disaster sort of end and where does, healthcare and prevention and all these other sort of things start. We don't really know how to differentiate those sort of things. Then add in sort of the trouble of having lesser developed countries that are already a mess and are already dealing with a whole bunch of stuff, right? Think about our video from last week with Nigeria. They're trying to deal just with kidnappings and all these other sort of things. Does their government have the capacity to start worrying about a new epidemic or all these other sort of things? For a lot of people, they would say, yeah, these big national organizations have really let these countries off the hook, right? Nigeria, no surprise, is also one of the most corrupt countries in the world, right? And so if we have WHO and Red Cross going in and doing a lot of their prevention and treatment and other sort of things, does that let them off the hook for doing other sort of stuff, right? When they have a lot of things going on, they can be like, you know what, we don't have to worry about health because we got people who are working on that. And so let's just focus on some sort of thing. But is that fair to the other sort of countries? This goes back to that question from last week. Is prevention better than treatment? Of course it is, but at what cost? How do we do this? How do we make sure that the most vulnerable are getting that sort of care, while the wealthier ones are never the ones who are in question about whether or not they will get care? When does disaster end? We don't really know, right? Prior to this year, usually I would talk about Ebola at this point. Ebola has been around for a really long time. It's not something that has gotten to main sort of public consciousness up until the past decade, because we had some really big Ebola outbreaks. But actually, if you look at Ebola, it's been around for a really long time. However, most of the cases of Ebola only happened in Africa. And well, hey, we don't really care about people in Africa, right? That is a sarcasm. I care about people in Africa. But what we have seen in a lot of ways is like, oh, if it's just happening to poor people that are far, far away, we don't really give a shit about it, right? When did we start caring about Ebola? Well, we started caring about Ebola when the world started getting more globalized, and when people could get on a plane in somewhere in rural African country, take 2 stops, and suddenly they're in the United States. Well, Ebola doesn't know where you are, and Ebola doesn't carry a passport, right? And so that is when we started caring about these sort of things. And so when we saw some of the big outbreaks of Ebola, first in the early 2000s and then again in 2016, all of a sudden we really cared, right? And we cared because it was a global issue. And so we had to think about these sort of things. Much like HIV, we are starting to see that there are more treatments for different sort of diseases. And so at what point does this transition to a chronic health issue rather than a pandemic? Same sort of thing that we can see with COVID right now, when we talk about these sort of things of right now it's an emergency. And so we have a lot of funds and everybody's feeling generous and we're doing all these sort of things. At some point, we'll also say like, yeah, this is just something that we have to live with. And so where do we make that transition in terms of whether it's Ebola or HIV or whether it's COVID? All of these sort of things become long-term issues that we're going to have to figure out how to handle. And that's where political will and sort of the niceness of like, let's all work together to solve this starts to fall apart. But again, with diseases and other sort of things, this is where we're starting to see a lot of interesting stuff. The world gets smaller and smaller every year with technology, with modes of transportation. You can go anywhere in the world within a few days, and that has a huge issue for disease spread, and diseases and other sort of things create a lot of national security issues. If all of a sudden we see an influx, how do these sort of things all work out? And then when we look back again at developing countries and other sort of places, they have other crises that they're dealing with, whether it be political instability, whether it be other sort of issues of clean water, whether it be a ton of issues. And then on top of it, we put a crisis. How do we make sure that we are balancing these things in a way that is efficient and good for everyone? So for this week, I really want you to just sort of mull over that. Think about, how does this complicated patchwork of international organizations intersect with countries at varying levels of development? Where does it intersect where things are an emergency versus where things are a long-term sort of issue? Do we de-incentivize bad governments to not make improvements because we're there to help? But at the same time, what about the people who are the poorest, the people who are most likely to suffer? Well, yeah, they're going to suffer whether the Red Cross is there or not. They're probably less likely to suffer if they're able to have access to these non-governmental organizations. And the people in the countries who are wealthy and privileged, they're going to be probably fine anyway, right? They're the ones who have money to leave the country when things are bad. They're the ones who have the money to get access to drugs and healthcare treatment when they need it, right? And so how do we balance these sort of things? It's a really hard patchwork sort of idea of, we have all these different levels of development. We have people living within different countries at different levels of privilege. How do we solve these issues without enabling or further de-incentivizing countries to not do better and not improve and not do well by their people? Is there a way to balance all of these sort of things, and how do we make it fair for everyone? And what does fair even mean in this sort of context? Does fair mean nobody dies needlessly? Does it mean everybody pays their fair share? What does fair mean in this sort of environment where there's so much going on with so much to juggle, and we all really are interconnected, even if we are living within our own sort of times and places? It's a really complicated web, and we can see how we do it well in some instances and how we don't do it well in other instances. So that is going to be sort of the basis for your class activity this week. But if you have any questions about any of the stuff we've talked about today or any other sort of thing, shoot me an email, send a request for a Zoom meeting. I'm happy to chat with you. And I think that's all. All right. Talk to you later. Bye.